Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Emerging Scholars in Premodern Critical Race Studies virtual symposium. I'm excited to chair this next panel. It's called Making Race in European Texts and Ephemera. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Alexandra Montero Peters from Texas State University. And their paper is called A New Approach to Reading and Seeing Black Characters in the Text and Illuminations of Castilian Manuscripts. So, Alexandra, take it away.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. So let me make sure. Do we all see everything? Looks good?
Yes, looks beautiful.
Okay. Amazing. Okay. So today I will share two different case studies from 13th century Castilian works that reveal the interpretive potentials of illuminated manuscripts, specifically in regard to represented skin color within frameworks of medieval race. The first is from the Libro del Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, or the Book of Games, a late addition to the expansive manuscript project Alfonso X the Learned of Castile patroned. Begun and completed in 1283 in Seville, it pulled from Arabic chess treatises, depicts Muslim men and women, and possesses an array of illuminations of daily, courtly, and royal life across the diverse Mediterranean. My focus from the Book of Games will be this illumination of chess players and entertainers from Folio 22R. There are many details in this illumination, but it is the 5 characters deep complexion that has most frequently drawn modern scholarly attention. Represented skin color is certainly significant in medieval art, functioning as one of the many racializing indices of this period. However, uncovering the visual and historical significance of this illumination prompts a reevaluation of how depictions of Black figures are analyzed both within Alfonso's court and elsewhere in the medieval world. Scenes like that of Folio 22R are sometimes treated in isolation, divorced from their manuscript and context, or, troublingly, in blanket assessments of similarly complected characters. Recently, scholars have challenged these approaches and urged medievalists to divest future scholarship of modern biases, like automatically linking Black skin with Africa or unfreedom. This is particularly relevant for Folio 22R. It has something of an interpretive tradition that identifies these men as enslaved because of their skin color, an argument that reifies modern racial constructs and relies on an outdated understanding of enslavement in the Middle Ages. I argue for an alternative approach to Folio 22R and those like it, whether visual, textual, or both. The charismatic Black characters of Folio 22R must be contextualized within and not divorced from the bespoke narrative of the Book of Games. These particular characters do unique work within the manuscript. They uncover how one Mediterranean ruler, Alfonso X, idealized court culture and crafted iconographies of prestige. The Book of Games advertises and leverages Alfonso and his court's perceived knowledge about and connections to diverse characters and peoples and centers of power from Iberia to India and North Africa and the Mongol world to prove Alfonso's expansive influence. The visual cues of Folio 22R, particularly its inclusion of courtly details, make it one of those wise, well-resourced courts in Alfonso's representation of cosmopolitan power. As such, Folio 22R is given a positive cast. Indeed, its scene mirrors illuminations that exalt Alfonso himself in the Book of Games. Against a rich and deep blue backdrop, a chess game is captured mid-action. 2 Black men are seated on the floor, maintaining eye contact as they engage in conversation over the chess pieces, their hands gestures emphasizing their dialogue. There is a small red pillow in front of the man wearing red, decorated with the Arabic word fez, without diacritical marks. Fez, Morocco, then under Marinid control, was perhaps the location of this scene. Given Alfonso's long-standing imperial desires for North Africa, and given his sometimes bellicose, sometimes inviting relationship with the Marinid ruler Abu Yusuf Yaqub, this pillow is a detail that underscores how porous the Strait of Gibraltar was and how significant Marinid centers of power were to Castilian imaginings of the Mediterranean. These men are bearded, wear red turbans, and long tunics. These features mark the men as Muslim, an identity that seamlessly maps onto Marinid Fez. As for the women, they elevate the scene as they entertain with fruit, music, and libations. Like the man seated next to the harpist, one wears the expensive transparent linen seen elsewhere in Alphonsine Illuminations. This textile is a sign of wealth and privacy, attributed in other sources to Almeria and Malaga. As I can discuss further in Q&A, these women are representative of the famous Qiyan of Islamic tradition. Such women were often, but not always, enslaved and trafficked alone or in ensembles. From Baghdad to Seville, in both Muslim and Christian contexts, they were prized for their erudition and cultivated skills at court. They mastered courtly entertainment, which always included poetic recitation and singing, but also often included other skills, like playing instruments, shadow puppetry, and yes, even chess. In Seville, during Alfonso's lifetime, Muslim travelers remarked on how old women would train these performers and, I quote, sell them to the kings of the Maghreb and Ifriqiya. There are also objects and art from Alfonso's court that link women like the Qiyan to his rule, such as this sadly humidity-damaged illumination of Alfonso watching two fair-skinned Qiyan play chess in the same manuscript, or the funerary pillow of his grandmother, Queen Berenguela, with its female musicians and dancers. I'm happy to discuss both of these more in Q&A. Within the imagination of Alfonso's court, if not within its real environs, Qiyan symbolized courtly affluence and sophisticated taste. Such sources about court culture frame for us the power and wealth of the Book of Games' two Black men, whom we could say are Maghrebi rulers. My second case study shows that within the same manuscript project, positive imaginings of Blackness like Folio 22 could and did exist in tension with negative formulations. For example, Alfonso commissioned manuscripts on Marian miracles, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which laud Christianity's superiority. Rather than leverage diversity to show royal influence, this work displays an increasingly hostile approach to non-Christians, frequently cast as an enemy of the Virgin Mary. Regarding Muslims, this text calls them, quote, ugly bearded crews or blacker than Satan, pejorative and racializing characterizations. Consider the miracle of a young woman delivered from the fires of judgment after her mother-in-law entraps her for one of the most taboo crimes for the period, extramarital sex with a person of a different religion. In the accompanying illumination, we see the mother-in-law force the unwilling, enslaved Black Muslim man with shackles on his feet into the bed of her son's wife. With this man, described as, quote, black as pitch, in her daughter-in-law's bed, the implications are dire. The Siete Partidas, an Alphonsine law code, stipulates that a married Christian woman having an affair with a Muslim man, quote, shall be placed under the power of her husband who may burn her to death, end quote. We see the husband in this illumination marshal witnesses and condemn both her and the Muslim man to the fires. Luckily for the woman, the miracle of the Cantiga is that her prayers of the Virgin Mary save her and prove her innocence and purity. However, the so-called infidel burned, quote, until not a single sign of him remained, his own innocence disregarded. As good Christians, women needed to maintain their purity for their husband and male kin's relative honor, and for the honor of God, to whom they were also, per the Siete Partidas, quote, spiritually the wives of our Lord Jesus Christ. The scheming mother-in-law of the Cantiga sought to weaponize this gendered responsibility to kill her son's wife, and the Alphonsine collaborators of the scriptorium capitalized upon the shockingness of the staged allegations in both racial and religious ways. This example shares little with the Book of Games in its formulations of Blackness and approach to Muslims. That is because, despite having the same patron, the world of the Cantigas is fundamentally different to that of the Ludic manuscript, and it embodies different narrative desires and engagements with human diversity as a result. Furthermore, and unlike the Book of Games, it demonstrates the relationship between race and religion along stereotypes of enslavement, and that they were changing in the 13th century across Iberia. Before I conclude, I want to underscore that generalized inquiries into, say, all the represented Black characters in works like the Book of Games or Cantigas can limit untold interpretive possibilities and reify modern racial constructs. For example, it was deliberate that the only other Black chess player in the Book of Games did not make an appearance. Unlike illuminations of nobility and royalty, these two men lack symbols of power like Kion or fine clothing. While this folio 55R may not contribute to the same narrative as folio 22R within the Book of Games, it does prompt questions for future scholars about class and daily life, and about the choice to paint a Black chess player in this scene as opposed to any other character. These two case studies show the varied approaches to Blackness among Alphonsine materials and indeed in Mediterranean sources writ large. The tension between them is not one that must be reconciled, but rather one to be explored more deeply. An adaptable reading allows for broader understandings of race and racecraft in the 13th century Mediterranean, and it invites further consideration of how and why Christian centers of power like that of Alfonso's Castile did or did not develop racialized identities in text and art. The case studies I have discussed underscore the need I highlighted at the start, to approach art and text on their own terms, and to build out of them the polyvalent, multidimensional ways race was imagined, leveraged, and understood in the Middle Ages. Thank you.
Thank you for these illuminating case studies. And as you can see, we've got the virtual applause going. All right, our next speaker is Laura Francis from National University of Ireland in Maynooth. I might have mispronounced that. And the paper is titled The Translation of Race in the Early Modern Irish-Iberian Diaspora. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Yasmine. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Hopefully, if I can remember how to do that correctly. Let's go. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that okay. So I guess just to start off, I wanted to quickly thank the Newberry Library for organizing this fantastic symposium and for having me here today. Thank the European Commission for giving me the funds basically to do this research. And also the biggest thank you to everyone in the audience who's taken time out of the afternoon or morning, wherever you are, to come and listen to all of us today. So I'm excited to share a little known piece of Irish, Spanish, and English history with you that I hope will help us better understand the long and really complicated construction of race over the 16th and 17th centuries. In 1492, as many of you likely know, the Spanish monarchy initiated a series of political and religious reforms that would shape the world as we know it today after the fall of Granada and the completion of the so-called Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Which on the one hand, this obviously created a very haunting century of exile for Jewish and Islamic populations who were essentially forced to either convert or leave and flee their homes. On the other hand, it was also a time of refuge for Catholics who needed to flee from the violence of English expansion in Ireland and came to settle everywhere from Santiago de Compostela to Salamanca to Sevilla across the peninsula, ultimately creating a series of religious colleges where Irish students could study their faith under Spanish protection. And while the former instances of exile, I think, are pretty common knowledge at this point, the latter isn't quite as well known. And given that difference, I propose that their records can really offer some key insights into the construction of identity at the time. Because on the one hand, the Irish acceptance onto Spanish shores enabled critiques of England that were otherwise repressed, allowing them to reject English attempts to assert their kind of supposedly inherent superiority over the Spanish, who they often characterized as a kind of barbarous empire with blood that had been tainted by their connections to the medieval Muslim history of the peninsula, which we just heard a little bit about Alexandra's wonderful talk, as well as English attempts to assert their inherent superiority over the Irish, who were often portrayed as kind of either being completely innocent and in need of English aid and assistance, guidance, if you will, aka colonialism, or that they were seen as kind of wild and rebellious or even savage and in need of English subjugation, violent subjugation. But on the other hand, the Irish acceptance into Iberia also helped reinforce the blood politics of the Spanish Empire as they brought their purification efforts that they started at the fall of Granada to a head with the final expulsion of the Morisco populations, that is, the Muslim communities who had converted to Christianity and remained in Iberia after the fall of Granada into the early 1600s. So today I want to briefly cover examples from each of these kind of sides of the coin: Irish acceptance as a way to reject English colonial ideas of race as religion, and Irish acceptance as a way to reinforce Spanish imperial ideals of race as blood. And I hope that this will help us better understand the integration of these concepts into what the incredible scholar Nomi Nazai has described as the early modern racial matrix, which she says is a matrix model with its ever-threatening fertility, calls for vigilance as it signals that race as phenotype is neither the first nor the last racial paradigm that will emerge. It is interlocked with race as religion and race as rank. And when a new racial paradigm emerges, as it will, race as phenotype will be interlocked with that new paradigm too. Race, in other words, is a flexible and canny conceptual continuum. It bends, moves, and changes with the times, as best serves its purpose of hierarchying difference in service of power in whatever context it operates. So first, I'm going to turn to some what I think is really fascinating material from the Irish College in Salamanca that disrupts what I think are the fabrications of this racial matrix for English colonialism and English hierarchies of power. In specific, the direct translation of English edicts into Spanish allowed Irish exiles to defy the reduction of their people into the disparaging terms of race as religion. So in the translation of one edict from 1610, for instance, we can kind of immediately see the language of pestilence being linked up with their identity, saying in the first point taken from these edicts, they call us betrayers, traitors, fugitives, and disturbers of the peace, infection and pestilence of the land, whose end is to take obedience to the king from the souls of his vassals under the pretext of teaching them our faith and false doctrine. And the translator doesn't just take this rhetoric lying down, like he doesn't just kind of document it for the Irish College to kind of know what was really convey the history of what was happening that might have otherwise been suppressed. The documentation also shows kind of a message of resistance to this idea, leaving the note after all of these points about the edicts with, notwithstanding all of this, our people walk through various places, particularly those places that are most in need and most destitute of their own priests, where the pressure and total lack of help is the worst, yet maintain them with incredible fruition. So, in other words, the English efforts to repress Catholicism and repress the Irish native populations will not only lead to kind of the spread of their spirit across Ireland, but also kind of its greater fruition in the end, with a hopeful note. So other edicts also make this case even more strongly. In a document from 1624, for instance, a translator actually inserts himself into the discourse and almost kind of literally pokes holes in the English argumentation, saying, with a very rough translation, the throngs of Roman clergymen, who they scornfully call papists, brought little to these parts, exercising their ministries without suspicion here, intending to introduce foreign power in their speech, and extracting an incredible amount of money from the vassals of the Republic along their way, with great detriment to the royal crown, which the edict calls the imperial crown, perverting the hearts of its vassals in the love and loyalty to their legitimate and natural king, removing these vassals from their creed, which they call the true religion, bringing them to the Roman Catholic faith that is said to be blind and superstitious. So essentially here we can see how the translator takes the English discourse, brings it into Spanish from English. It's kind of a strange, like originally from English into Spanish, now I'm having to back translate it into English again. You can see the original English discourse here highlighted in bold. And then the way that the parenthetical statements kind of interrupt the flow of that discourse to critique it, to adjust it, to show where the translator thinks that the edict has gone wrong. And I think this use of parentheses effectively opens up space for the Irish to define their own character from their exile in Spain, essentially attempting to undo the ideas of pestilence, infection, false religion that the English are attempting to impose on them in the racial matrices of the day. But at the same time, I think anyone who's familiar with Spanish history will likely hear the echoes of other expulsions in these translations. The representation of a religious group as a pestilence immediately recalls the portrayal of Jewish populations, sadly throughout much of history, medieval history, but also especially at the dawn of the Spanish Empire in 1590 or 1492, that continued to echo into the early 1600s when the Spanish monarchy decided to expel the Morisco population of Muslims who had converted to Christianity. Unfortunately, these echoes are embedded within the very same archive of materials from the College of Irish Exiles in Salamanca, where we just saw the examples of colonial resistance. So here, for example, we can see the other side of the coin or the tapestry and the way that the Irish cause actually reinforces the hierarchies of difference that were so important to the Spanish Empire. With saying, to the right of the chapel's main altar, they ordered the carving of the kingdom's arms in the slate stone with a sign that says the following words. This college was built by the kingdoms of Castile for the sustenance of the Christian religion of Ireland in the year that Philip III, Catholic king, threw the Moriscos, enemies of the faith, from the same kingdoms in the year of 1610. So in this document, King Philip was clearly eager to connect his generosity toward the Irish refugees with his rejection of another group. In other words, the Irish supposedly represent a genuine defense of Catholicism that deserves the help of the Spanish Empire, while the kind of medieval Moorish blood and background of the converted Moriscos clearly still runs in their veins for them and therefore allegedly cannot be trusted. So that means that within the same archive, even though we have some kind of threads of the racial matrices being undone, at the same time, we also have them being made stronger by the Irish documentation here. So to conclude, I hope that this has distilled at least a little bit of the complicated ways in which the longstanding ideas of race as religion and race as blood could be resisted as well as reinforced in their translation across political, cultural, and linguistic borders. And I also hope that it leaves us with important questions for our understanding of migration today, thinking about, which groups do we accept in our societies, which do we reject, and how can we undo some of our own prejudice with maybe a better understanding of where those positive or negative biases have come from in the past. So again, thank you so much for listening, and a very big thank you to the institutions who have supported my work, especially the National University of Ireland and Maynooth, Government of Ireland, European Commission, and the many scholars who have created the foundations for the studies. This is like the most abbreviated possible bibliography I could get onto one slide, but there are many, many more. And if this has interested you at all, I'm trying to do more public humanities work, and you can follow my new X account, and I'm uploading project data, like all of the documentation that I'm working with, to GitHub. But thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much for sharing your analyses of these texts from the Salamanca archive, and everyone's giving you a round of virtual applause. So exciting to hear your work. Next up, we have Margaux Delanay from Cornell University with a paper entitled The Stigma of Print, Race, Female Chastity, and the Poetry of Complaint. It's all yours. Take it away.
Thanks. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
In the article, The Stigma of Print, a note on the social bases of Tudor poetry, published in 1951, J.W. Saunders asks why so few of the poets of the English Tudor court sought out print publication, and why later commercial poets pretended not to have sought it out. In Saunders' telling, gentlemen amateur court poets of the earlier 16th century felt a real aversion to the publicity and commerciality of print, and they preferred to circulate their poetry in manuscript among intimate friends. While it was socially desirable for amateur poets to avoid print, however, for professional poets at the margins of courtly society, the achievement of print became an economic necessity. Saunders describes how this necessity created a bind for these professionals. They had to achieve print publication in a way that circumvented the social stigma of print, hence the many anonymous or pseudonymous publications of the period, and the many prefaces that insisted that the poet's friends had urged the work into print. Although contested, the premises and terms of Saunders' argument have been widely absorbed into scholarly accounts of early modern English print culture. This paper revisits the term and reconsiders its utility for us as readers of early modern English poetry and also as scholars of pre-modern critical race studies. The stigma of print describes the social circumstances of poetic production, but as a term it sits above or outside of poetic language. Saunders derives his concept of stigma from 20th century sociology, not from 16th century poetry. In keeping with the norms of the sociology of his time, his sense of stigma is abstract and immaterial, like that of Irving Goffman, the kind of exemplar of this form of mid-century sociology. Goffman begins his book Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity, with some strikingly corporeal language as he surveys the historical meaning of stigma as a mark on the body, from the cuts and burns of Greek criminals to the eruptive blossoms on the skin of Christian saints. But he turns to define stigma in his usage as the disgrace itself, and rather than the bodily evidence of it. So Goffman's insistently immaterial stigma strangely first appears as these cuts, burns, and eruptive blossoms. In a similar way, the richly material vocabulary of stigma comes forward in Saunders' abstract language too. He writes that the stigma of print was black enough to denigrate even the unexceptionable. The Latin word here for black and denigrate, which is literally to make black, denotes a glossy color of black that can be used for describing the brilliant black of ink, such as that used in printing. Saunders grants stigma an inking blackening quality that recalls one form of physical stigma, while stigma as a mark made upon the skin as a token of infamy or subjection can be made by branding with a hot iron. It can also be achieved through what 16th and 17th century English would call pricking or tattooing, and of course tattooing with ink. So moving through metaphor and reading against the grain of Saunders' immaterial concept of stigma, we might gloss the denigrating stigma of print as something like a tattoo or mark on the skin of printer's ink. Rather than abstract, purely social stigma, the stigma of print begins to look more like the stigmatized somatic marks where Patricia Hachimi locates early modern racism and the creation of race. The stigma of print in this sense, a blackening by means of contact with printer's ink, is the plot of the genre of female complaint poetry that was prominent in England in the 1590s. In my paper today will just give one instance from Michael Drayton's collection of epistolary complaints, England's Heroical Epistles, first published in 1597, which opens with a description of literal stigmatization. In the first epistle in the collection, Rosamond writes to her lover, King Henry II of England, in distress about living in sin as his mistress. Asking him to read these tainted lines drawn with a hand impure, Rosamond writes that to look at her epistle is to look at her. And she writes, "The scribbled paper which I send to thee, if noted rightly, doth resemble me. As this pure ground, whereon these letters stand, so pure was I, ere stained by thy hand. Ere I was blotted with this foul offense, so clear and spotless was mine innocence. Now, like these marks, which taint this hateful scroll, such the black sins which spot my leprous soul." Rosamond uses the metaphor of what Wendy Wall calls the original scandal of writing, the marring of the fair page by black ink, where writing stands in for sexual activity. In Rosamond's epistle, the white unmarked page is her chaste and pure soul, onto which Henry wrote the black marks of sin and sex. Rosamond's metaphor might seem to point to a fictional handwritten letter that she actually sent to Henry. What the reader reads is then only a print transcription of this real original manuscript letter that we might imagine. But I think that the insistent deictics of this passage challenge us to take Rosamond's demand to look at the surface of her letter more literally. In her insistence on here, this paper, this ground, these letters, these marks, this scroll, Rosamond points not to a fictive or imaginary handwritten letter, but to the actual printed page on which Drayton's early modern readers encountered the poem. Rosamond's sin is literalized as the stigma of print, as denigrating marks of ink on the page, or even on her skin, the conventional fairness of female beauty, and Rosamond's proximity to the sonneteer's language of Black beauty gives her paper the suggestion of skin and her inkblots the suggestion of stigmatic tattoos. In this way, even as Saunders did not draw from the vocabulary of early modern poetry in his conceptualization of stigma, his denigrating stigma of print strikingly resembles early modern poets' own language for what print publication does. I don't have time here to show this in detail, but this passage at the beginning of Drayton's work sets the tone for the collection. This is clearly how he's thinking about the relationship between the reader and the stigmatized poet exposed to the reader's eye. Rosamond's stigmata of ink in this way make legible an early modern concept of the stigma of print, of the shamefulness or disgracefulness of print publication that is grounded in a racialized analogy between ruined female chastity and the marked page. The print stigma that I'm describing links up with the phenomenon that Miles Greer describes in Inkface, the slave stigma in the English imperial imagination. Greer argues that early modern English writers figure Black skin as the product of a permanent overlaid ink, in other words, as a tattoo, or in other words, again, as a stigma, in its originary concrete sense. Greer uses the term inkface to describe a complex of techniques that use a racialized blackness of ink to stigmatize a given person as one who could never be an insightful reader because she was meant to be read by a white expert. It might seem that I want to argue that Drayton condemns or scapegoats Rosamond, that she represents the unchaste woman whose stigmatization makes her the other to early modern English society, that the system of stigma is meant to contain her safely as a textual object to be read. But I think this reading would not capture the complexity and even the charisma of Rosamond's writing, and that of other female complainants of the period in poems by Samuel Daniel, William Shakespeare, and others. I think Drayton's Rosamond is exemplary of the utility that the figure of print stigma had to poets of the period as a strategy to be assumed. Rosamond's status as a palimpsest, whose racialized purity is visible beneath the stigma of ink, is emblematic of a kind of middle form of agency by which print poets might make themselves both agents of writing and objects to be read. The specific instance of stigma in Drayton's Rosamond epistle points towards a concept of print stigma that resembles, though not exactly, Saunders' understanding of the stigma of print. In this way, we might see how the early modern English systems of print poetic authorship is racialized and sexualized at its heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. Again, we've got the virtual round of applause. This was fantastic. Chris was saying when he was chairing the previous panel, talking about texts that relate to him. And of course, as someone who studies the Tudors, I am always interested in research that thinks about race making in the Tudor court, and in this case, through ink. So that was really exciting. Now we are on to our next speaker, Ana Rhoda Sanchez from Queen Mary University. And this talk is entitled Racialized Attitudes Against Jewish Converts in Toledo. Welcome, Ana.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen. Can everybody see it? Sorry, so I'm just trying to see how I can present.
Anna, click slideshow up next to animations. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Anna from Queen Mary University of London, and I'm here today to talk about racialized attitudes against Jewish converts in Toledo in the middle of the 15th century. So let's situate ourselves in Toledo in year 1449. On 27 January, the city started a revolt against royal authority because the king and his favorite, Álvaro de Luna, wanted to impose an extraordinary taxation. So some residents and some civil authorities strongly opposed to that, and they quickly targeted Jewish converts, so-called conversos, in the city. On the 5th of June, 1449, civil authorities issued the Sentencia Statuto de Pero Sarmiento, and it basically said two things: that conversos were banned from public and ecclesiastical offices, and secondly, that they were also forbidden to testify against older Christians at court. In short, conversos were discriminated on the basis of their Jewish origin. And so we can find expressions in the text like perverse lineage of the Jews and lineage and ralea of the Jews. Ralea is a Spanish word with quite a pejorative meaning to signify the origin of someone. So the first reactions by King Juan II of Castile and Pope Nicholas V were of strong opposition to the Toledo Rebellion and the exclusion of conversos from public and ecclesiastical offices. On 28 August 1449, a sermon was preached in Valladolid, most likely by order of the king, who was present while this sermon was being delivered. And the sermon praised charity and defended the equality of all faithful by virtue of their baptism, the soul baptism. Nearly a month later, Pope Nicholas V warned against the discrimination of conversos and their descendants in humani generis inimicus, in this bull. He also urged Castilian bishops to safeguard the unity of the church, and in a separate bull, he excommunicated the leaders of the Toledo Rebellion, that is, Sarmiento and his allies. And we go to the intellectual debate that was generated from the rebellion, and we will look at the Instrucción del Relator by Fernán Díaz de Toledo. Díaz de Toledo was relator, that is a notary, at the Royal Council. He was himself of converso origin, and he wrote the Instrucción between October and November 1449. The exact date is unclear. In this work, he said that Christ was of Jewish descent according to the flesh, según la carne, and therefore there was nothing wrong with Jewish descent. Christians who were of Jewish descent, therefore, were full members of the church, fully Christians. And he added that Toledo rebels spoke as if baptism did not have all its effect on men, leaving in them a spot or a defect. And it's interesting to see the words in Castilian, mancilla, because I think here this opens the room to talk about race. In particular, Fernán Díaz de Toledo emphasized that accusing the descendants or calling the descendants of conversos was fundamentally wrong, because, and he did so through a particularly personal note, saying, "My children and grandchildren are truly not converts. They are children and grandchildren of Christians, and they were born into Christianity, and they do not know anything about Judaism, nor its rituals." A few weeks later, Marcos García de Mora wrote El Memorial. García de Mora was the ideologies of the Toledo Rebellion and one of the strongest supporters of the rebellion from the beginning. However, he wrote this work in jail because by the end of 1449, he was taken prisoner by Prince Enrique and Pero Sarmiento, that is the leader of the Toledo Rebellion, because they thought that he wanted to surrender the city of Toledo to King Juan II of Castile. This text represents a reaffirmation of his ideology and what I believe is one of the biggest attacks on conversos in 1449. He described the church as the congregation of the faithful, Congregación de los verdaderamente creyentes, whereas the synagogue was considered a congregation of beasts, Congregación de bestias. For him, conversos were nothing more than baptized Jews who belonged to the synagogue and had a spoiled lineage, what he calls línea dañada. Conversos were accused of Judaizing and therefore heretics. In this text, in El Memorial, García de Mora makes an interesting comparison between himself and Fernán Díaz de Toledo, whom we have said was a converso. He calls Fernandina de Toledo a traitor, a Jew, and therefore an heretic, and as having the expression of a despicable Jew. And I added the Castilian expressions from the text. In opposition to it, he considers himself loyal, defender of the faith, and an old and clean Christian. But I believe that this is not only a comparison between two people, but between two social groups. So in a way, what we have here is a comparison between conversos and older Christians in three different levels. At the political level, we have traitors versus loyals. At the spiritual level, we have heretics versus defenders of the faith. And then the third dichotomy that we've seen, despicable clean, I think it has to do with race. However, something changed in the 1450s. In October 1450, Pope Nicholas V lifted the excommunication of the Toledo rebels, following the recommendation of King Juan II of Castile. A year later, the Pope ordered an investigation to identify and punish converts who embraced non-Christian traditions. And a few years later, between 1454 and 1458, Lope de Barrientos, who was the Bishop of Cuenca and a prominent defender of conversos at the royal court, acknowledged that some conversos were indeed crypto-Jews. So we find here a change of position from both the political and the ecclesiastical authorities. I believe we can draw three main conclusions from these presentations that have to do with the social status of conversos in Toledo. The first one is that the Toledo rebels prompted discrimination of conversos based on their Jewish origin, which they consider inferior to that of older Christian families. And this opens really the room to explore issues of race within local urban societies in late medieval Iberia. The second conclusion is that although the Toledo Rebellion was appeased by 1451, I think the rebels succeeded in spreading a climate of suspicion against converts. Because we've seen that by the 1450s, even the king and the pope were willing to admit that conversos were fundamentally suspects and were not to be trusted. And the third conclusion, and here I would like to open the room for discussion later, is if we could say that they succeeded in bringing race into play. Otherwise, why did pro-converso parties embrace the assumption that converts were more likely to fall into heresy and error? Showing here the sources and the images. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you for this talk. We, again, wonderful community here of support and virtual round of applause. I really appreciate you asking us to think critically about the use of the term conversos and how it invites conversations about religion and race making in the 15th century. So that was a delight. I want to remind everyone that you can put questions in the Q&A, and we will be getting to those after our final speaker. I am delighted to introduce Linnea Reipenberg from Stockholm University. And this paper is entitled Courts and the Making of Race in the European Hinterland, Representations of Blackness in Festivals of Scandinavia and the Holy Roman Empire. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this. I'm going to share my slide. Okay, so in my talk, I will treat two different cases from my dissertation. And the first one concerns Protestant states of early 17th century Holy Roman Empire, and the second treats late 17th century Denmark. Before I begin, I must inform you that the material I'm about to show contains explicit and violent portrayals targeting Black people. My primary source consists of festival books. And these are exclusive illustrated records of significant ceremonial events for rulers, such as baptisms or weddings. They depict theatrical processions where noblemen in black, among other characters, parade through city streets before competing as teams in tournaments at the riding track. Often the festival books delineated fictional narratives about the different groups. And at the picture to the right here, you can see a tournament in action in Frankfurt at the public square. Theatrical representations of blackness from this time are often linked to interests in the transatlantic slave trade. So why did the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire depict blackness the way they did, despite lacking direct colonial ambitions? Their political and economic resources were directed towards the domestic conflict between Protestant and Catholic states. The political tensions were high and war could erupt at any moment. To address this question, I will account for 3 examples. The first one is from a festival in the state of Hesse-Kassel in the year 1600, where a category of characters named Nigriten appeared. I quote, "After Actaeon entered in hideous appearance and demeanor Nigriten, from the river Nigri in Africa, a Moorish or Ethiopian people who mostly go there naked, live all over the furthest part of Africa, and is the most dreadful people that you can find in the world." And then they go on to describe the physical features that it finds so repulsive. After this aggressive depiction, they turn to the topic of religion. He is called Belian, who is the highest and greatest prince. He is a Christian, but blends it with much superstition and also with Jewish ceremonies. At the heart of the Reformation lay naturally a denunciation of Catholic practices. Several Protestant theologians claimed in vehemently anti-papist writings, specifically that Catholic exorcism originated from pagan and Jewish traditions, resonating with precision in the rendering of the corrupted faith of the Nigriten. The statement about their degenerated Christianity would hence, in the inflamed state of religious conflict, evoke associations to Catholic rituals. Simultaneously, the Nigriten perform white supremacy versus black inferiority and Protestant purity of faith versus superstitious Catholic practices. In another festival book from a wedding in Pfalz in 1613, blackness embodies a racial agglomeration. I quote, "A black Moor beating on drums, completely naked, with an Indian loincloth and a small Hungarian hat decorated with feathers." By associating the Hungarian headdress with the black Moor and the emblematically exotic loincloth, Hungarians were presented as subjects of exoticism in a performative distancing from Eastern Europe. In yet another celebration, in a festival held in Anhalt in 1614, the Moors were described as kohlschwarz, coal black, and depicted in loincloths. However, in the festival book's fictional narrative based on the medieval epoch Orlando Innamorato, it stated that they represented Circassian Tartars and Saracens, Muslims who were not in this context typically depicted as black. Their blackness emphasized the otherness of these Muslim groups on the borders of the Christian realm. Conclusively, by racializing non-black groups, blackness served in this historical context as a semiotic mark of exclusion in a process of emplacing different groups outside of identity thresholds. This technique operated on several levels. It ostracized non-Protestant Christians, non-Western Europeans, and Muslims. Consequentially, the color-coded binary should not be understood as just one among these identities in the process of formation. Instead, the white-black dichotomy here served as a fundamental building block for differentiation between the self and others. Representations of racial blackness hence possessed a unique role in shaping a quintessentially white, Protestant identity in the states of the Holy Roman Empire. While the German case is shaped by the religio-political conflict within the empire, the Danish paintings I will discuss were created during a period when Denmark sought to expand its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The material consists of a series of paintings from the 1680s, showing King Christian V and his sons performing equestrian exercises. The paintings depict a tournament held in celebration of the engagement between the king's sister and the Swedish king. 5 of the paintings depict the royals attacking a head, likely made of wood or papier-mâché, representing a young black woman. This exercise, called running at the head, was already popular, but heads usually depict males. These paintings are housed at Rosenborg Castle in Copenhagen, and when I contacted staff there a little over a year ago, they informed me that they were still on display in a stairwell of the castle in a part of the building open to visitors. The testimony of an eyewitness, Matthias Skalund, tells that, quote, all the houses around the riding ground were full of spectators, and even all the fences and roofs were full of people, unquote. In addition to these images, one of the paintings in the series depicts a target in the shape of a Turkish warrior. This figure is depicted wearing a turban, carrying a shield and a lifted sword, and the facial expression is wicked. It represents the common traditional stereotype of an Ottoman enemy soldier. It is the heads of the women that deviate from standard depictions. The faces of the heads have an innocent expression with red lips and rounded cheeks. They appear to be representations of a very young person. The woman is wearing a striped headdress and a shawl around her neck in a style that probably represents their idea of an African headdress. The anonymous artist appears to have intentionally depicted the heads as civilian rather than military, contrary to the representation of the Turkish soldier. Military strength was tied to masculinity, making a female warrior an oxymoron. But would this not undermine Denmark's portrayal as a slave trading state? On the contrary, this colonial propaganda relies on representing a non-military figure to emphasize that the regulation of legitimate violence of interstate warfare was irrelevant. Instead, the images drew on a tradition of enacting colonial violence as a legitimizing strategy. The Danish constitution was the most absolutist among all European nations during this time, and the images are saturated with royal symbols. The king's mark branded on the horse's thigh, the red-heeled shoes, and the symbols of royal orders are there together communicating the importance of this action being executed by the omnipotent monarch and his heirs. The brutal motif utilized pre-existing notions of gender and race, violence and commodification, and the paintings creatively produced a relationship between Denmark and the enslaved by an imagery of extremes, omnipotency and social death. In the Danish paintings, female blackness indeed delineates the limits of humanity. In the German festival books, blackness serves to semiotically define the boundaries of Protestant identity in formation. They challenge us to take a look at 17th century representations of blackness beyond their role as superstructures in colonial economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Linnea, for this thought-provoking talk. We have our virtual round of applause from all of our attendees. And I'd also like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their work with us. We are now going to begin the Q&A. I want to remind you all that all attendees are invited to submit questions to the Q&A function on Zoom. And I want to encourage our symposium participants to unmute and ask a question. If you'd like to, we'd love to see your face. So let's get started.
I have a question.
Yes, please. Drew, hello.
Hello. My question is for Professor Montero Peters. I'm sorry, I wrote it down, I promise.
Sure.
So thank you for your wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I hear your point on not simply reading these images in a certain sort of modernistic lens, but it dawns on me that there is a kind of racializing narrative within the broader text-image interaction of the manuscript. So the first is the Orientalism, the first is Orientalism, and I'm thinking particularly here about Said's third part of his definition as a kind of production of knowledge and authority about a particular place, polity, location, or culture. Whoever wrote or was directed to write Fez clearly understood Arabic, how Arabic is written calligraphically, with the extended tooth of seen in the terminal position, right? It's upwards, as we often see in Arabic calligraphy. So to what extent would this sort of capturing of calligraphic styles communicate a kind of authority about like Islamic language, Muslim language, Arab language, and culture? And then secondly, if indeed the producer or the reader understood the direction Arabic is read from right to left, this directionality from right to left would counter the left to right orientated text found elsewhere in this manuscript. And thus would serve as an embodiment in and of itself of the inversion or backwardsness of the language of Muslims from that of the Europeans. We see elsewhere where pseudo-Kufic is used, right? A kind of, not actual Arabic, but like garbled, like looks like Arabic, but isn't really, is used in medieval art in order to communicate this sort of like unlegibility of Arabic and the texts such as the Quran that are used or that language produces. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. A lot to unpack there, and I will do so gleefully because if there's anything I like to do, it's to talk about my manuscripts. And I just possess them somehow, my manuscripts. I don't know. It's not quite not quite right. But so your first question, right, is about this potentially the somewhat of an orientalizing approach to language and the domination over that language and other markers that pertains to. And I think that's an interesting one, particularly in the case of Alfonso X's court. And I just want to be really clear that sometimes I might call Alfonso the author, and I don't literally mean he put pen to paper. He's got a lot of folks working under him, right? And I think actually that's a good place to start because those folks encompass at least one known Muslim, al-Rukuti. We have Jews, we have Christians, both from Iberia and elsewhere, especially from Italy, who are Latinists, and many more that we might never know about, right? As well as the artisans involved. And why such a diverse group of collaborators within the scriptorium mattered is because Alfonso was particularly he manifested this desire in the Western Mediterranean to incorporate in his vision of Solomonic, all-encompassing wisdom, texts from the Islamic or Islamicate world. So he translated many texts from Arabic, not into Latin, but into Castilian, because he was trying to position Castilian's dominance and hegemony within Latin Christendom as well as the Mediterranean. And the Book of Games reflects that in significant fashion, right? So the first, I want to say 60 chess problems in the section dedicated to chess, because there's other sections, are translated from Al-Suli or Al-Adli and their chess treatises. And so they're problems taken from Arabic chess manuals and just given illuminations. And so when we go over to this domination over the language, well, yeah, right. Like there was a very political and intellectual need for somebody like Alfonso and his court to be able to navigate these sorts of texts. And not just because one king has a particularly esoteric intellectual desire, but because these are really permeable boundaries, right? Alfonso's Castile has as a vassal the Nasrid Granada. They are continuously in contact with the Marinids. Like I mentioned, sometimes that was in war, but oftentimes, like when Alfonso was overthrown, Alfonso sends a missive to Abu Yusuf Yaqub saying, help me. And he says yes. And instead of helping, he pillages. But beside the point, right? You see that there's this ever-present relationship across the Strait of Gibraltar and also the Islamic parts of Iberia. And so part of me thinks, yes, there's a sense that Alfonso can project that he understands and can claim as his own texts that were written in Arabic, but also part of me wants to be cautious and say this is a super multilingual universe by necessity. And so maybe there's this push and pull, and that's very fascinating. And then the inversion with the language, right? Potentially with Arabic going the opposite way, right? Of Castilian being perhaps something to note. I think that there's a potential for that. And at the same time, I think that Arabic wasn't as foreign to these individuals. And so I wonder how much that inversion played into the artisans and the collaborators' understanding of the dynamics between Muslim and Christian. But what I think is important is that this is legible, whereas there's other examples where it's, like you said, the pseudo-Kufic script that kind of gestures toward something kind of Arabic, but you can't penetrate the meaning, right? And I think that to me, actually, rather than an inversion, situates certain centers of power whose language is Arabic. So that could be Nasr Granada, that could be the Maghreb Ifriqiya, as people with a seat at the table. And that language is worthy, and that language of power is worthy of understanding and being intelligible to a Castilian audience. And so that's at least my understanding, but I think that it's such a capacious sense of meaning. Like there's so much you can do with this. And that's why I was so excited to reevaluate it based on previous scholarly appraisals. Because I think that it shows how rich the cultural moment was in 13th century Western Mediterranean world, and how it's going to change drastically in just a generation. And so I hope I kind of answered. I mean, I could keep going, but I want to pause. I think those were wonderful questions, and happy to answer more as they come up.
Thank you for that explanation. Our next question is from Patricia Manning, and it is for Laura Francis. I am curious about how you see the relationship between the Irish, Scottish, and English colleges in Spain. Have you seen the translation issues that you analyze in the translation from other national colleges? Do you think that the Irish colleges were perhaps more enduring and/or influential because of the manner in which the Irish situation interacted with the Spanish one? A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Patricia. It's a really good one. And at the moment, I haven't yet gotten into the comparisons with the other national colleges. And I'm really curious for the very same reason to see if the same types of translations come up. I mean, I know that there are other groups like Ana Zayas, for instance, and Valladolid is leading a research group on the English colleges that were established there and has some interesting things to say about them. The only translation that I can think of that I saw in the National Library of Spain that was more in an English context of a woman who had faced persecution in London for continuing to practice Catholicism, was put into jail, then escaped to France, and she wrote a letter that was in English that was then translated into Spanish. Complex networks of migration and everything. Was kind of along similar lines in that it described in very great detail the persecution that she had suffered, what it was like to be in jail, and to be kind of told that she needed to either give up her faith or face the consequences, face torture and these kinds of things. So in that sense, that rings very true with the other materials that I've been reading in the Salamanca archive. There are also some letters that describe in pretty harrowing detail what it was like to try to practice Catholicism in secret, and some of the executions that took place when people didn't follow the rules. So from the small knowledge that I have of it at the moment, I would say yes, very similar. And then to answer, but much more to be done, and that people are doing it, I'm excited to get into. And then to answer the second part of the question about the enduring nature of the Irish, I do think that might, I speak with caution, having not done the comparative work with the other national colleges yet, but I think that the nature of the relationship between the Irish and Spanish Irish colleges and the Spanish government did have a special role to play in that because of the Irish mission, something that I didn't get a chance to mention, but the fact that these colleges were really, their purpose was to train priests to go back to Ireland. They were supposed to receive a grant from the Spanish king directly, although that didn't always work out. Sometimes people like to stay in Spain in the sunshine, I think, a little longer than they were supposed to. But they're meant to go back to Ireland. Cristina Lozano, the person that I cited at the end of the bibliography, has a really great book on mapping when there were peak years, like the number of missionaries that actually did make it back to Ireland, and kind of how that mapped onto different political events in the British Isles. So for instance, during the years of the Civil War, if I remember correctly, the Irish mission kind of had to come a little bit to a halt because it was too dangerous to get people over. But in other years, it really spiked, and there was some hope for spreading Catholicism. So I think the Irish mission was a big part of why that was an interest for the Spanish government to kind of keep this going, and possibly more so. I know that there were missions from the other national colleges, but I don't know if they were quite as strong in that tradition. And then there was also the Irish Brigade. So the fact that the Irish coming over were going into the military, occupying some pretty high ranks, I think more into like the 18th century though, rather than the 17th. So a big military resource for the government. And then, yeah, I guess thirdly, they also were able to serve a lot in more of the administrative ranks of the Spanish government. So these colleges were a really fruitful way to kind of spread Catholicism and also, fill the ranks of both the bureaucratic forms of government and also the military needs of the time. So I think that could possibly speak to why this, for instance, the Salamanca College was open until like 1950. So it had 260 years of history. So my math is correct. So definitely enduring, but I would have to defer to the scholarship, like I said, from Sayas and her group on the English colleges to get a real sense of whether or not my intuitions there are correct. But thank you for the question. I am excited to look into those more comparative contexts as I keep going with the project.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Leah Markey.
I
Awesome.
have a question. I also just got a message from Jared, who's having trouble using the Q&A. So if people are having trouble using the Q&A, feel free to direct message one of us and we'll get your question out there. So we can call on Jared next, but I'll use this time to selfishly ask my question. Linnea, those are such fascinating, rich images, both the ephemera and the paintings. I've been thinking a little bit about the discussion we had in the last session about production and reception. And I was curious about the text that goes with the images that you showed that must be part of the festival book. If you could speak a little bit about, what sort of context, more about the context of production, if that's known, and how production and reception work together for those festival prints.
Yeah, I've been trying to get more information about the history of the books and the printing processes and the volumes that were printed. I haven't really found that much previous research about that. But these were really exclusive publications. They were they were circulated in Europe, and it is actually even told that Louis XIV once sent one of these to the Emperor of China. So they were really they circulated in the within the European elite and beyond, and we know that they were traded for different things, for example, between countries, between Sweden and Italy, for example. So there was a lot of circulation of these books.
Thank you. And Leah, you said Jared has a question. Feel free to unmute, ask your question.
Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Awesome. So my question is for Margaux. Anna's presentation right after yours brought to mind a Jewish convert, John Trask, Christian to Jewish convert, who was punished for aspiring to become a father of a Jewish faction in 1617. He was branded, and that prompted Francis Bacon to make the joke that he who was schematicus may now be stigmaticus. And that, to me, made the comparison that as blackness was perceived to corrupt whiteness, so were deviant religious beliefs thought to stain the soul's purity. And given the condemnation of Jews in Tudor England, I was curious if you encountered language linking the blackness of ink to the wrong or immoral contents that were written with it, particularly those of Jewish or Hebraic origin.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. That's such a great question. I think there seems to be a very strong separation in this moment between the kind of love complaint Petrarchan poetry that I'm looking at, and longer confessional uses of, or religious uses of the image of writing. I was recently reading Brian Yadgey's work on the Book of the Heart. He writes about how Augustine talks about the heart as a book, and even pre-Augustine and throughout the Middle Ages, where the task of the scribe is to reinscribe the words of God onto the heart, and in that, bad writing could be understood as, in that metaphor, bad writing could be understood as false faith or incorrect faith. So that's a very strong and very long tradition that my examples seem to have sort of broken with. They're not as interested in the confessional aspects of the implications of the writing and the stigmatic writing. But this makes me want to look more at what Bacon said about that instance, and at John Trask. That seems like an interesting example.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Now I want to go to Linnea, who has a couple of questions. And this is always really exciting because obviously as panelists, you're all in conversation with each other. And this is something I really want to encourage. Yes, we're excited to have questions from the audience, but you all are more than welcome to ask each other questions and be in conversation with each other. So feel free, Linnea, to ask your question.
Thank you. Well, I have a question for Laura, and then I have a question for Margaux, or maybe a comment. When it comes to Laura's text, I was thinking about racialization toward the Irish population from England, and I was thinking about is there like the difference between religious persecution in general and race as religion, and do you see a decisive moment where race comes into play here? What is the racial in this, and why would this not be seen as religious persecution, more general? So
Yeah, actually, well, first of all, that's a really great question and one that I am constantly trying to grapple with. I know that I talked to a couple of the other panelists when we met a few weeks ago to try to untangle it, and it becomes very difficult. I think the difference for me is in the language that's used to describe an inherent character associated with someone of a particular race, kind of similar actually to what Anna's talk was about. The idea of a converso as somebody who, I can't remember, forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing this, Anna, correct me, but as somebody who is unloyal, like an unloyal person, or somebody as opposed to a real Christian who is, a defender of the faith. And that's it was actually really striking to hear that paper on materials that were 150, 160 years, again, math hopefully is correct, before what I was writing about, because that same kind of language crops up in the characterization of the Irish as in that first edict point that they were kind of considered traitors, desleales, so unloyal doesn't really translate very easily, but kind of somebody who's betrayed us. And the idea that they are an infection and a pestilence. So the idea that not just the religion has taken hold, but the people themselves, there's something within them that is inherently kind of evil or bad, not just that they're practicing the wrong faith and that could be corrected. But it is interesting. The case of Ireland is really interesting because depending on what colonial text you're reading, sometimes you'll see, I kind of mentioned, that the Irish are just kind of innocent people who need to be taught the true way, kind of similar to characterizations of Native populations in the Americas, even looking back to Las Casas's writing that was taken up for the Black Legend, that they just don't know any better and they can be taught, differently. But then there are other ones where you do see this kind of language of infection, rebellious, like Spencer, if you read The View of the Present State of Ireland, is really wary about intermarriage, for instance, because it's going to take over the English population. We can't have mixing like that. So I guess to just sum up, that it's more about the inherent qualities that are being described. And then the strange thing about the Irish is that sometimes they're described with those inherent qualities and then sometimes they're not. And I think the English are trying to figure out the best way to characterize it and disavow connections between Ireland and Spain, because they knew that that was a potential weak point for them politically. So I hope that answers your question, but that's kind of where I see the difference for me anyway.
Thank you. And then I had a comment on this quote, Margaux, by Miles Greer, the black skin as the product of permanent overlaid ink, in other words, as a tattoo. And I think it made me think about some of the material that I'm working with and the way their discourses around blackness as something that is on the surface, as something that is not a tattoo, but something that is burnt. Their skin is burnt and therefore they are black. It's burnt by the sun. And I think that I really don't know how to theorize this and how to conceptualize it, because it's not, I don't think the concept of epidermal is relevant here. I don't think it's applicable, because it's more that something has happened to the surface of the skin than actually a layer of the skin within, in a biological sense. So to me, it just seemed like something that was really interesting, because I do think we need to theorize this issue more when it comes to early modernity.
Yeah, I don't particularly have anything to add on to that. I think that's very true.
Actually, Linnea, you might want to look at the work of Valerie Traub and Ricardo Padron's contribution to our Seeing Race volume also deals a little bit with this issue of zones of the earth and skin color, and theories about this in the medieval Renaissance period. I can follow up via chat with more information, but it's a really important, good question. Yeah, sorry.
No, thank you, Leah. This is my favorite part of conferences, is like having that dialogue, sharing resources, talking through ideas. We did have another participant with their hand up, Eliza.
Hi, yeah, my question, sorry.
No, go
My
ahead.
question is for Anna. Yeah, that was a really interesting presentation. And I was wondering, because you talk a little bit about the racial dynamics and the comparison between the pure, clean, ancient Christians and the despicable converts, but you didn't mention the word marranos, which was very much connected with the filth as well. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about that as well. And I'm wondering about Lope de Barrientos, the Bishop of Cuenca. He was thought to be a convert himself as well. And since Cuenca was one of the biggest number of executions during the Inquisition, so what was the connection there as well? And if you can explain that a little bit further. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for these fantastic questions. Yes, indeed, marrano was a word that circulated, but to be honest, I have not found it in my text. This is why I was a bit hesitant to bring it up, because I think in the text it comes a little bit later. But yeah, so that's the reason why I think it's a bit early at the time that I'm looking at the moment. I'm now looking into 1460s sources, and it still hasn't come up. So I think it might take a few more years. And about Lope de Barrientos, yeah, he was indeed thought to be a converso himself, and he was in close relationship with Fernandíaz de Toledo. So he was also the confessor of Prince Enrique, so he had a huge influence in both the king and the prince. And he was one of the people in a very important diocese, as you said, the Diocese of Cuenca, to defend conversos. But in the end, his discourse was a little bit weakened. So I think he just surrendered a little bit to the pressures of the anti-converso parties. Also, Cuenca at that time, we would still need to wait a few decades for it to be a strong anti-converso city. So it began in places like Seville, then Toledo, then Ciudad Real, and then it extended to other dioceses. But right at the time that I'm looking at, which is before the Inquisition, because my project finishes when the official Inquisition was established in 1478. I think Cuenca is maybe a little bit early for that. But thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Our next question is from Patricia Manning. Thanks to all of the presenters for their fascinating papers. My question is for Professor Montero Peters. I am wondering if you have thought about the material production, that is the pigments, used for skin colors in these manuscripts. Is there a discourse about the expensive materials used to portray complexions going on here? To my mind, the expense involved in that deep blue background that generally could only be achieved by ground lapis lazuli very much marks the chess scene as courtly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patricia, for this question. I actually think that we're at the beginning of scholars doing truly crazy interdisciplinary work, in the sense that we have art historians working with like chemists now on some of these Alphonsine manuscripts to really parse out the chemical makeup of some of these pigments. And so, right, we know that, like you said, this blue pigment from the Book of Games is conclusively shown to be from lapis lazuli. There are, interestingly, some other Alphonsine manuscripts that use azurite to create the blue pigment. But what's really fascinating about this manuscript in general is that I'm scouring my brain. There's a few exceptions when the desire is to portray something outside. So like there's a scene where a Muslim and a Christian play chess in like a tent that you might see in a military engagement, like the kinds that are brought to the front lines playing chess, and the background is just the parchment, right? There's no further painting. But aside from a few of those examples, so many of the illuminations in the section on chess in the Book of Games have this rich blue backdrop, including when some of the characters are like an apothecary, right? Like you see an apothecary shop making things, right? So there's like, it's interesting because the blue is sort of attributed to many different classes, and maybe some of those classes do intersect with a courtly identity, right? But maybe sometimes it's a more broad understanding of the world in which Alfonso believes he has influence. And so what's really fascinating, I think, though, about just the expenditure on this manuscript in general, and why there was this desire to, out of all the peoples in the world, depict a scene of courtly prestige with represented Black figures, is that there was this tradition, at least within the 13th and 14th century, of ennobling Black courts, right? And that culture, you see that in the Catalan Atlas, for example, and its depiction of Mansa Musa amidst all of the other non-European rulers that are depicted across the Mediterranean and far beyond. And that representation, right, there's an interplay between perhaps some aspect of exoticizing, but also it's enmeshed within the iconography of all the others, right? And so I think that's what's powerful about this is, yeah, it does have in the Book of Games a blue backdrop. It also has like the red fruit and the libation, really expensive clothing, and other things that are very legible across different groups. And those also contribute to making this a courtly illumination, and one that was very exciting to unpack for me, because some of the other scholarship has called that scene sleazy. It's not my word. And has, really denigrated what position that plays in building out courtly prestige across contexts that don't just pertain to the Christian-Iberian, let alone, right, just Christian. It expands, right? And I could go on, but yes, the materiality of it absolutely contributes, just in ways that we're still continuing to unpack. So thank you so much for that question.
Thank you for that answer. And now for our last question, I want to turn it over to Anna.
Hi, so I have a question for Laura, and it's about if you could explain a little bit further if there's any information in the archives in Salamanca, which I don't know if there is, but just asking, the relation between the Irish College and the bishop and the civil authorities in the city. So how did these authorities relate to the college? How did they see the people in the college? Did they integrate them into the city life, the religious life, liturgies, or were they in a way segregated? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I was actually in that same document, interestingly enough, where they talk about the expulsion of the Moriscos, Felipe also orders for, I'm not going to remember the exact name, but basically for the authorities of Salamanca to kind of take the Irish under their protection and to make sure that they're treated well, essentially, and that they hold, oh gosh, I could get you the more detail, like the specifics on this, but basically that they hold like a public mass for St. Patrick's. That's literally like in the next line. It kind of bizarrely goes straight from like, we gave them this home, this chapel, after with the expulsion of the Moriscos, and also we want you to have a St. Patrick's Day celebration every year with like these really specific things about the mass and what it's going to be like. So definitely seen as like under the protection of the king, I would say, and local authorities. And I guess even beyond that, there are also some documents that just like letters, for instance, where we even see cross-cultural support, like across the whole Spanish Empire. Like there are some interesting letters from the Archbishop of Cusco in Peru, who was donating materials to like help build the library at the Salamanca College. So not just even within the local community, but also broader and out from that. But at the same time, there were a lot of tensions about like where the money was going to come from, how they were going to continue the support for this. And it took a few decades of kind of the Irish clergy advocating for themselves in order to finally secure, I think it was like money from like a Cadiz account or something like that, to finally like secure themselves there. And there were some tensions within different Irish students who felt like they were more integrated than others, depending on like the area of Ireland that they came from, Northern Ireland versus like some of the Southern Irish communities, and also some tensions with the other national colleges, like whether or not they would be split up with like the Scottish, or the money would be split up with like different orders, or like the Scottish or English. So definitely taken under the wing of the Spanish government at the time, and bureaucracies, but not to say that there weren't other kind of rifts that occurred in that, and definitely not totally smooth. And they didn't have a stable home for a fair number of years because of those money issues, especially. I hope that answers your question.
All right. I want to thank each of our panelists for sharing their research and our attendees for their thought-provoking questions.